Okay, so my name is Ben Davies. I'm a research fellow at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics here at Oxford. And yeah, as I say, the session today is going to be linked to, but not fully dependent on, the practical ethics and responsibility competition that we run. And so the aim of the session today is to just kind of run over some key ideas and then talk a bit about the competition. And so just some practical things to get started with. As you hopefully were alerted to when you joined the call, this is being recorded. If there are any issues with not being able to hear me, not being able to see slides, any issues with my connection, hopefully none of that will happen. But if any of that does happen, please just speak up with the raise hand function or by just butting in, that's fine. And I think Liz is going to send out some feedback forms after the event is over. And so we are always looking to improve our events and make sure that they're useful and valuable. So please do, if you are able to, please do fill out those forms when they come to you. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I just said in answer to Davy's question what I'm going to do, but just a kind of brief overview. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some different ways the idea of philosophy is understood. The idea of responsibility, rather, is understood in philosophy. I'm going to then talk a little bit about what we're looking for in the practical ethics and responsibility competition. And then there'll be time if there are any questions at the end, or if anyone wants to kind of discuss anything that we've talked about. But I think, particularly as we aren't very many at the moment, you should feel free to just jump in, really, when I'm going over, particularly the philosophical stuff. You know, if what I'm saying isn't clear, or you'd like me to expand on something, I think that's absolutely fine for you to just jump in and tell me. So I'll get going. So when we talk about responsibility in philosophy, we tend to see it as philosophers as a kind of umbrella term. So although we're using the same words, a number of different distinctions have been drawn that mean that what exactly responsibility means is going to depend on the context in which it's used and the purpose to which it's put. So thinking forward to, if any of you are entering students into the competition, it's important for them to think about what sense of responsibility they want to talk about when they make the videos, when they get going on thinking about responsibility and practical ethics. Okay, so I think hopefully will be helpful to clarify at least some of these different ideas by using an example. So if we imagine two people with young kids who want to go out for the night and they hire a babysitter, and so they leave the babysitter in charge of their children. And while they're out, the babysitter just kind of sits around watching TV and is aware in the background that the two young kids are kind of causing a lot of chaos, creating a lot of mess. They are wrecking the house. And the parents will come back at the end of the evening and be rather disappointed, of course. So we might ask, who is responsible for this mess? Indeed, that might be a question the parents ask. Who is responsible for this mess? I don't know if anyone wants to kind of chip in about how we might answer this question. Who is responsible for the mess in the story that I've just told? Any thoughts? Okay, so Debbie in the chat says the parents. Debbie, do you want to expand on that a bit? Why the parents?
I talk rather than type.
Yeah, up to you.
Because the children are safe, and it was the parents, and that's what the babysitter is there for, to make sure that the children are safe. And it was the parents' decision to go out and leave the house with the babysitter. So okay. The babysitter has basically done what her responsibility was.
Okay, that's interesting. Anyone else? Anyone have a different idea?
I'm inclined to agree with Debbie in as much as was the babysitter adequately sort of briefed on what the parents expected.
Okay.
But then is it a teenager's responsibility to impose discipline? And also, I think it depends what age the children themselves are.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
If they're old enough to take responsibility themselves for their behaviour, and if they've been taught and they're exploiting the fact that their parents are out to play up to a babysitter, if they're old enough to understand all of that, then they have some responsibility as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think I have a slightly different interpretation than the two of you, but that's absolutely fine. So in my view, it is part of the responsibility of a babysitter to make sure that the children you're babysitting don't wreck the house. But we can disagree about that. But assume I'm right. Okay, assume I'm right that is one of the responsibilities. The babysitter really ought to have stopped the children from wrecking the house, I think. But nonetheless, my interpretation of this example, I think, gives us a few different answers to the question, who is responsible for this mess? Now, Sam's just noted that we might want to know how young the children are, how old they are, right, in terms of whether they have any responsibility. But no matter how old they are, even if they're very young children, they have responsibility in one philosophical sense, which is that they caused the mess, right? They were the most direct cause of the chaos. I've said that I think the teenager might have some responsibility by virtue of the fact that they could have done something about it, right? They could have stopped it, and maybe, in my view, although not Debbie's view and maybe not Sam's view, they should have done something to stop it. And then Debbie suggested that the parents are responsible because they're the ones who made the ultimate decision to go out and hire the babysitter. But here's a different sense in which the parents might be responsible for the mess, which is that they're ultimately the ones who are going to have to clear it up. They're the ones who are going to have to take responsibility for dealing with the mess. Okay, so these three ideas, and of course, as I say, you can disagree with my interpretation of that particular case. These three ideas are aiming to get at three different notions of responsibility that are used in philosophy. To start with, the first sense of responsibility, which is causal responsibility, right? The children, I said, are causally responsible for the mess. And here's at least one way of understanding that idea. If it wasn't for the children, the mess wouldn't have happened, right? If they'd sat and behaved well and watched TV or gone to bed on time, the mess wouldn't have happened. And the mess happened because of their behavior, right? What they did was a kind of direct cause of the mess. But I want to suggest, at least if we imagine them to be young enough, they aren't morally responsible for their behavior, right? Why aren't they morally responsible? Well, if we imagine they're kind of 3-4 years old, say, they didn't know any better, right? Maybe they haven't been told. Maybe even if they have been told, they're not of an age where we can really expect them to just control themselves, right? Maybe they need external instruction to control themselves. And so I think we want to say, or I want to say, that the children are responsible in one sense, they're causally responsible, but they aren't morally responsible, or at least not fully morally responsible because of their young age. Okay, so let's turn to the babysitter. The babysitter is also causally responsible, right? This time in a negative sense, right? He could have jumped in and prevented the children from rampaging around the house. And if my interpretation's right, and he really ought to have done something about it, that's part of his job, then he knew better, right? He knew, maybe, let's assume, to add a detail, that the parents briefed him before going, right? If the children are rampaging around the house, breaking things, please make sure you stop them. He knew that was one of his responsibilities, or one of his duties as a babysitter. So these two conditions go into a kind of fairly old account of what it means to be morally responsible for something from Aristotle, which is still quite popular amongst philosophers today, right? We've kind of developed the analysis, but we largely haven't rejected the analysis of what it takes to be morally responsible, which is that to be morally responsible, you have to meet two conditions. And these are respectively called the control condition and the knowledge condition. So take our babysitter again. Babysitter had control over his behavior and indeed over the outcome. He could have acted differently. He could have intervened. And if he'd acted differently, that would have changed the outcome. Now, similarly, there's at least a sense in which the young children have control, right? They could have acted differently. And if they'd acted differently, they would have changed the outcome too. But where the babysitter and the children differ, I think it seems, is in terms of knowledge. So first of all, the babysitter has knowledge of what will happen if he lets the children carry on rampaging around the house. Maybe the children have that knowledge too, right? They know that if you drop something, it will break. They know that mum and dad or their parents are going to have to tidy up after them. But we might also think that the teenager, unlike very young children, has in some sense relevant ethical knowledge, right? He has knowledge of right and wrong. He has knowledge of what he ought to be doing, which I've suggested is intervening. The children, if they're young enough, don't have this knowledge, or at least we can suppose they don't have this knowledge. So whereas the babysitter, I want to say, meets both of these conditions, the children only meet one of them, maybe, one of them kind of to some extent, and maybe neither of them fully, and so shouldn't be held morally responsible. Okay, so we're going to come to the third group, the parents, in a moment. Right? I've suggested there's this third sense of responsibility that might be interesting to us. But first of all, I'm going to just look in a bit more detail at these conditions. So when we think about control and knowledge, right, we've got, as I say, we've got these categories from Aristotle. What contemporary philosophers have done largely is to think in a bit more detail about what these conditions mean. So here are just a couple of examples. I'm not going to offer any answers to these questions, but these are just a couple of examples of the potential complexity of thinking about these two conditions on responsibility. So first of all, when it comes to the control, right, we might want to think about what exactly that means. So for instance, does an addict have control over their behavior? Well, in some sense, they do have control over their behavior. Addicts can generally respond to reasons, including reasons not to engage in the behavior that they are addicted to. So someone who is addicted to something that's illegal, for instance, most addicts are able to hold off from taking illegal substances if a police officer is walking right by, right? Some aren't, but most are. So there's a degree to which addicts are able to control their behavior. But we might think, and probably most people think, that degree of control isn't enough, right? Although there's some degree of control, they don't have full control over their behavior. And the control they exert is exerted with much more difficulty and maybe much more hardship than most of the rest of us, at least with respect to our kind of day-to-day life. So we might wonder about what exactly it means to have control over our behavior and what the threshold is for having enough control to be held morally responsible. Similarly, when it comes to knowledge, in the babysitter case that I just outlined, the babysitter has knowledge, where I've assumed, right? They know what's going to happen if they let the kids carry on running around the house, and they know that they ought to really step in and intervene. But we might wonder about the person who doesn't know, either doesn't know what's going to happen or doesn't know that it's wrong, but could easily find out. They could easily Google it, or they could easily look it up, right? So someone who sets off on a course of action without knowing what's going to happen, but where they could maybe have done a bit more research and found out what's going to happen. Do they meet the knowledge condition? Do they know in a way that's relevant to holding them responsible? Okay, let's think now a little bit more about the idea of control. So some of you, I don't know whether you are determinists or believe in free will, maybe you've never thought about it, but some of you might be thinking, Well, hang on, this control idea, how does that fit in with quite a popular view in philosophy, which is determinism? Right? Determinism is just the view that all of our actions are ultimately determined by prior causes, things that happened long before we were born, right? We can trace from every single one of our actions, every one of our decisions, a causal chain back to some earlier events that necessitated, that made definite that it would happen, that we would behave in this way, right? So that's a deterministic view. A kind of weaker version of this view might be, well, we're not determined in that way, right? We do have some scope to act, but nonetheless, our behavior is heavily causally influenced by these prior causes, right? So the particular decisions that I'm making now to give this talk, for instance, are influenced by all sorts of things, my genes, my upbringing, my social environment, all sorts of things I had no control over whatsoever. And so there's a kind of worry here that if responsibility does require control of the kind that I've suggested, maybe we're never responsible, right? Either because we couldn't help but do what we did, even when it might seem like we could have, or because even if we could have helped but do what we did, actually our influence, the influence that our decisions have, is quite minor compared with a whole host of other influences. Okay, so I'll think about a couple of different ways that we might respond to this challenge. One way is by accepting it, right? One way is by saying, no, you're right, we don't actually have control and therefore we aren't responsible. Here's another way that might retain some responsibility. So we can distinguish between, and philosophers have distinguished between, two different ways of thinking about the idea that we have control over our behavior. One is the idea of regulative control. And what that means is it's ultimately completely up to you whether you perform an action or don't, right? It's totally up to you. Nothing else is influencing you. And you get to decide whether to perform an action or not. And it's this idea that seems threatened by the deterministic view, and even by this kind of idea that we're heavily causally influenced by things outside of our control. Right? It looks like if either of those views is correct, it's not really up to me, or maybe it's not up to me how I behave, whether I perform an action or not. If determinism is correct, any action I perform, I couldn't have performed in it. I couldn't have acted in any other way. Okay, but there's a second kind of understanding of control, which we might take, which is called guidance control. And this is the idea that rather than having this binary choice between acting or not acting, there's a sense in which you, as an agent, as an individual, guide your behavior in a particular direction. So even if you couldn't have guided it in a different direction, there's a sense in which you guide it in the direction that it ends up going. And what does that mean? That might sound a bit odd, I think. I think some people, when they come across this idea, find it a bit hard to distinguish it from regulative control. So it might help to contrast it with ways in which we might lack guidance control. So for instance, if I am sitting here, and the reason I'm sitting here is because I'm drugged and I can't move, I'm not guiding the way that I'm acting. That's being, in a sense, determined by something outside of me. My will, my desires, my preferences don't play any role really in deciding what I do. Similarly, a slightly more complicated case is going to be where someone's threatening me, right? Someone's standing just out of shot, holding a gun to my head and forcing me to stay here. This case is a bit more complicated because I do, in a sense, guide my behavior, right? I do, my decisions, my desires, my preferences, my will does have a role to play. I'm the one who ultimately decides to carry on sitting here. But my actions are, in a sense, ultimately the reflection of someone else's preferences, right? They are guided much more by someone outside me than they are by my preferences. Okay, so that's one way that philosophers have kind of tried to respond to this idea of this worry about free will, right? By saying, well, actually, there's a form of control that's relevant to responsibility, that doesn't require that we could have chosen differently. Yeah, Sam, you've got a question.
I was just wondering if there's another contrast that can enlighten it in a different way. I was thinking about people with either Tourette syndrome or brain damage who lose their inhibition and lose both, either or both, of inhibition and impulse control.
Yeah.
Whereas most of us might control ourselves and not swear in front of a senior or a teacher, someone with Tourette's has no control over that. I had a student in a class once with Tourette's, and it was, unfortunately, he had a very good sense of humour and was very confident in himself, so it provided quite an hilarious course for us all. And I'm sure sometimes he played on it. But that's a different kind of control to the kind of the example you gave of someone who's under coercive control of either a drug or someone holding a gun to their head. That's in a way more deterministic, because there's something in the body's neurology that is dictating that to you. So I just wondered if that is something that has been considered as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess cases like this, in one sense, might be a kind of motivation for this very worry, right? So once we start saying things like, well, look, this student who has Tourette's, in a sense, it's their brain doing it. It's not really them, right? It's kind of something neurological rather than them. That might be a way in which we might kind of colloquially talk about it to kind of emphasize the way in which it's not under their control. The worry about this is going to be, I think, that there's a sense in which everything we do, or everything we do purposively, is our brain doing things, right? There's no self outside of the brain, we might think, or at least our brain is heavily involved in every deliberate action we take. So I mean, it's a question, right? This isn't me trying to put forward a particular view, but it's a question to what extent actually the case of someone with Tourette's is ultimately that different in terms of whether the actions they're performing, swearing, ticking, whatever it might be, are actually them doing things, right? Or whether we sort of attribute it to their brain. But I think, yeah, maybe this idea of guidance control might be helpful here, right? So we might think that although there is a sense in which this is really them, it's not some external force doing these behaviors. There's a sense in which my knowledge of Tourette's is kind of fairly lay knowledge, so I don't have any kind of specialist knowledge of it, but my understanding of it is there's a sense in which the behaviors that constitute Tourette's or come from Tourette's are they're not guided by the person's will or preferences, right? They're kind of experienced as external. Now, if that's right, and that may not be right, but if that's right, then we can maybe see the idea of guidance control as helpful here, because we can see that this person does not have guidance control over what they're doing. It's more like a kind of knee-jerk reaction, if that's right. Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. You're right that we don't only experience threats to our control over our behavior from outside, right? We also experience potentially threats over our control over our behavior that are internal as well. Yeah.
I was almost thinking that the example of Tourette's might be more useful to the question of whether or not we have free will. Because when you look at people who have Tourette's or brain damage, or some types of brain damage, they have, at least in certain circumstances, it's easier to see how they have lost free will compared to others of us who don't have that same condition. So I was thinking of it in relation to the do we have free will? And I was thinking, well, if we contrast with someone who has Tourette's, then we have an impulse control that they don't. So does that mean that we do have free will? Is that a certain proof we do have free will? Because you can see the contrast with when you lose that capability.
So I think, yeah, thank you. I think it's going to depend on what we mean by free will, right? If free will means a will, and again, think about this kind of regulative idea, a will that is undetermined by external forces, and which is totally within our control. It's not clear that kind of contrasting us with people who have Tourette's or other neurological conditions is going to provide that much evidence for that idea of free will. Because ultimately, the fact that I have impulse control is not within my control, right? It's not something I choose. It's not something I'm able to sort of switch on and off. It's just a fact about my brain or my personality or my character that I have this form of impulse control that someone with Tourette's lacks. So I think the worry is going to be that although it seems natural to draw that distinction, we have impulse control, we have this control over our behavior that they don't. Whether that is really going to qualify as a form of free will is going to depend on exactly what we mean by free will, right? And if we have this distinction between regulative control and guidance control, that might help us to kind of tease out exactly what we mean when we say, do I have free will? So again, it's not that I'm trying to suggest here that no, obviously we don't have free will, or that obviously this kind of contrast doesn't work in supporting the idea that we have free will, but that it's going to depend quite a lot on what we mean by free will, as to whether these kinds of examples establish that. Okay, so that's kind of one distinction that might be helpful in helping us to think about the idea of responsibility in the face of this challenge from determinism or worries about free will. Here's a different one, which is from P.F. Strawson. So Strawson says, look, even if it's true that we could only ever act in one way, right? We could only ever behave in one way. Responsibility has this really important social role, right? It plays this really fundamental role in the way we relate to each other as individuals in a society. So even if we could sort of philosophically or theoretically challenge the very idea of responsibility, it's not clear that that is something we could actually live as a practical ideal, right? We can't really, Strawson thinks, imagine a society where nobody holds anyone responsible, because he thinks that is part of what it means to treat each other as human beings, right? It's to treat someone as an agent who can be held responsible for their behavior. So if we think again back to our teenager, we might think that the teenager's behavior exhibits something bad about their character or their will, and that it's kind of perfectly normal, and it would be very strange if this didn't happen, it's normal for the parents to see her as an object of what Strawson calls reactive attitudes. They might be angry, they might be resentful. If they trusted him rather, they might feel disappointed. So Strawson thinks actually this kind of question about whether we have control is neither here nor there, really. What we need to think about is the social practices that responsibility underpins and whether we could imagine living without them. Now, there's potentially a bit of a worry here, which is that on this view, it seems like the justification for these social practices of responsibility are just kind of that they're useful, right? So one kind of skeptical way of looking at this is to think that, well, actually, we're not really justified in holding people responsible. It's just that we can't help it. It's just that we can't live any other way. We just have this kind of what's sometimes called a useful fiction. We pretend that people are responsible because it kind of helps things go along better. Now, Victoria McGeer argues that actually, on Strawson's view, there is a clear justification for responsibility practices, for holding people responsible, but that it's that responsibility practices are justified only when they will help people to improve their behavior in the future, right? So only if the parents holding the teenager responsible will help the teenager to be a better babysitter or to be more responsible as a person in the future, only then is it justified. But if they think that actually shouting at the teenager or saying how disappointed they are won't make any difference to their behavior, then they're not justified in doing that. Okay, so at this point, it might be helpful to introduce a further distinction between whether we are responsible for something, whether we hold someone responsible for something, and indeed some further ideas about whether we communicate this judgment, and indeed whether we punish people. So first of all, it might be that we can be responsible without being held responsible, right? It might be that nobody knows that we're responsible for something, and therefore we're never held responsible. But if we think about holding people responsible, that could mean several different things. It could mean just a kind of internal judgment. It could mean thinking to yourself that they are responsible. So the parents might come back, see the mess, and think to themselves, well, that was, what a terrible babysitter. We won't be hiring them again. But not actually tell the babysitter that they're disappointed or angry, and not impose any kind of penalty, refusing to pay them. But they might go further. They might communicate their judgment. They might say, we're very disappointed in you. We expected better. They might even punish them. They might call their parents, or they might just refuse to pay them for their services. So it's important when we're thinking about holding people responsible, again, that we're super clear about what we mean. Right? Do we mean just internally judging them responsible? Do we mean communicating responsibility? Or do we mean imposing some kind of cost, some kind of burden or punishment on them? And each of those could well be what someone means when they talk about holding people responsible. Sam, yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. The thought occurred on the previous slide when you quoted I can't remember what it was now, saying that we should only hold people responsible, or there it is, McGee, when that will help and motivate them to improve their behaviour. And the example of the teenage babysitter is fairly benign, but has bigger picture implications, because what about when we come to criminal behaviour, for example? Sometimes you get a repeat offender who it becomes fairly clear that they are not going to change their behaviour.
Yeah.
And so on McGee's count, if holding them responsible is not going to change their behaviour, then by McGee, we shouldn't bother. But then that has social implications.
Right, good. But so here's where that distinction I just mentioned might be useful. Now I kind of presented this as kind of building one on top of the other, but actually maybe that was a mistake. So you're right, on McGee's account, it looks like if we've got someone who habitually and repeatedly engages in damaging behavior, right? And they just don't seem, we communicate our sense that they're responsible, that they ought to have behaved differently to them, and they just don't seem to get it, right? It just doesn't seem to go in. Now, on McGee's view, of course, one answer might be we're not doing a very good job. We could try a different route to communicating responsibility. But ultimately, yeah, it might be that we're just not getting through. And on McGee's view, then it looks like we shouldn't hold this person responsible because they're not a person who seems like their will can be improved. That doesn't necessarily mean that we do nothing. It might be that we have a different justification for, for instance, if someone is presenting a really serious danger to themselves or to others, it might be that we don't incarcerate them as a form of punishment, but we incarcerate them as just for kind of practical reasons, right? We can't have you walking about the community, hurting other people. So, I mean, this might be the distinction between criminal incarceration and incarceration under the Mental Health Act, right? So when a person is detained under the Mental Health Act, they are essentially incarcerated. They're deprived of their freedom. But the idea although it might be experienced this way, at least in principle, the idea is not that they're being punished or that they're being held responsible for the things they've done. Indeed, the judgment is the opposite. It's that they're not responsible. They can't help but act the way they do. But we still, as a society, seem to think that we're justified in restricting some of their freedoms. But the justification is going to have to be very different, right? It looks like the justification is going to have to be not that they are responsible, but that they cannot be responsible.
I get that, and I don't disagree with that one. I was thinking about, for example, in some of the inner city areas that we see with groups of youths who, despite repeated ASBOs and then maybe a spell inside or repeated spells inside, simply carry on with the same behaviour when they get out, and over time escalate that bad behaviour into more serious criminal offences. So not so much those who cannot be held responsible for whatever reason, but those who can be held responsible refuse to be responsible. And again, the Greer there is saying, well, we shouldn't bother.
So I think for McGeer, the fact that someone doesn't respond to our attempts to hold them responsible, as I say, is going to be evidence of one of two things. It's either that they are not capable of improving their behavior, or that we're going about it the wrong way. Now, we don't need to get into the kind of whole political issue here because we've got a few other things to cover, but you might think if we're repeatedly serving ASBOs on people and repeatedly locking them up for minor crimes, and the effect is that they carry on behaving in the way they do and indeed seem to get worse, that might be a message to us that the ways we hold people responsible for those kinds of actions is not effective, right? And indeed, McGeer's justification for responsibility practices there might give us reason to change what we're doing. Whereas if we just thought, well, the justification for holding people responsible is that they are responsible and that they ought to, there ought to be cost to their behavior, we might not mind so much that their behavior doesn't improve. Okay, that's up to them. They're responsible people. We'll just keep holding them responsible. McGeer's justification is trying to be more forward-looking, I guess. It's trying to think of responsibility as a tool that we use as society to improve things. And so if our methods of responsibility holding aren't improving things, then that might be an argument for changing our tactics, at least in particular cases. That would be the idea, I think. Okay. Let's talk briefly then, because I want to make sure we get onto the competition, about the third kind of responsibility, which is role responsibility. So remember in our original example, I said, at least my interpretation was, the children that are causally responsible, but maybe not morally responsible. The teenager, I think, was morally responsible. Maybe we can dispute that. The parents, I say, aren't morally responsible for causing the mess. Now, Debbie, I think, challenged that idea because she said, well, they're the ones who chose to go out. They're the ones who, appointed the babysitter. I mean, I guess I would want to say, if you've taken all reasonable steps to avoid an outcome happening, you think you've appointed a responsible babysitter, then you aren't morally responsible for an outcome. But maybe we can dispute that. But in any case, whether or not they are morally responsible, we might think that there is this other important sense in which they are responsible. It's their job to clean it up. Why is it their job? Well, they own the home in which the mess is being created. The teenager's got to go, right? And there is a mess to be cleaned up. The toddlers aren't going to clean it up themselves. So there's a kind of, forward-looking sense of responsibility here, in which the parents have to take on the role of dealing with a problem. And so this is this other idea of responsibility, which is role responsibility, where you have responsibility for an outcome, not because of the part you played in causing it, but rather because of a particular position you hold. That could be a kind of social position, like being a parent or a homeowner. It could be a legal position, like being a judge or a member of parliament, or it could be an institutional position like being a teacher. Now, of course, having these roles that give rise to role responsibilities may well, in turn, give rise to moral responsibility. If you fail in one of your role responsibilities, then you might have a moral responsibility for that failure. So for instance, if you, as a teacher, just let your class sit on their phones and don't teach them anything, you've failed, arguably, one of your role responsibilities, and you might be held morally responsible for that. So the distinction comes in not at that point, but at the point where we're thinking about why you have that responsibility in the first place. Why is it a teacher's responsibility to teach the children in their class? Why is it a government minister's responsibility to help run the country? It's not because they caused the problems, right? Or caused a problem or caused an issue. It's because they've taken on a particular position or found themselves in a particular position. Okay, I'm going to skip over collective responsibility and just finish off before we turn to the competition with this idea of distributive responsibility, because I think this is a fourth very important idea in the responsibility discussion. And it's been kind of ignored a bit more by philosophers, but it's something that we've been looking at the Uehiro Center a bit more. So in the example that we were discussing about the teenager and the babysitting, we were kind of looking at this idea of moralized responsibility, right? So I mentioned moral responsibility, but the question we were asking was to do with whether someone should be blamed, right? And of course, there are going to be corresponding questions about moral praise, right? Responsibility isn't only for bad things, you can be responsible for good things. But responsibility is also, in our society at least, an important way of distributing benefits and burdens. And we do that, the way we do that is in a non-moralized way, at least it doesn't have to be moralized. Okay, so here's a different example. You drop your phone and it breaks, and you know it's not a break that can be repaired, and you didn't have insurance. You could have chosen to get insurance, but you didn't. Okay, so now a cost has arisen, right? A new phone is needed. And there's a question, who should shoulder these costs? That seems like the default answer is going to be, you should shoulder the costs. Why? Well, partly because it's your phone. You, in a sense, have a role responsibility as the owner of the phone. No one else is going to do it for you. But we can contrast this case where someone else breaks your phone, right? There's still this sense that you're the one who has to ultimately sort out getting a new phone. But if someone else broke your phone, you might think, at least at a moral level, it's their responsibility to pay for the new phone. They might refuse to, right? They might just say, well, it's none of my business. But we might still think there's a kind of moral level at which they ought to pay for the new phone. But if you dropped it, if it's your fault, then the default answer surely seems to be that you should cover the costs. You should be the one who pays for a new phone. Now notice that although there is a moral question here, who buys the new phone, who ought to do that, deciding that you are the one who ought to pay for the new phone doesn't require a moral judgment about you. It doesn't require that we morally evaluate you. So for instance, the fact that you dropped your phone, that you broke your phone, doesn't mean that we think you are a morally bad person or that you did something morally wrong, right? Whereas when we're talking about moral responsibility, we're usually talking about actions for which we blame or praise people at a moral level. In this case, it's completely neutral, right? You dropped your phone, that's just kind of something unlucky, but it's not something for which we should think that you are morally to blame. And yet we still have this idea, or at least we seem to have this idea, that responsibility might play a role in deciding who takes on the burden of replacing the phone. Now here's a more controversial application of that idea, which is healthcare, right? So sometimes we don't break our phones, we break our legs, or we find ourselves with other kinds of health need that have arisen because of choices that we made, where we maybe could have made different choices, and we could have foreseen that the choice we did make at least gave rise to a risk, right? So if we smoke, we can foresee that that might cause problems for our lungs in the future. If we go mountain climbing, we can foresee that there's a risk of injury. right? These are choices that we make, and health needs might arise because of those choices. Again, there's nothing to say that these choices are morally bad, right? We're not necessarily saying that to smoke is morally wrong or to go mountain climbing is morally wrong. But there still is this really important question of who should bear the costs. And so some people think that responsibility should go into deciding who bears the costs, not only of who breaks your mobile phone, who replaces your mobile phone, but also of who meets the costs of your health needs. Now, obviously, there are kind of various issues here, and responsibility might only be one of them. There might be a question of whether you can afford to meet the costs of your health needs. It might be that although you're responsible, we can't insist that you should pay because it's just too much money. We might think that in various cases, smoking is one example, actually the level of control you have because of addiction isn't high enough. You're not really fully responsible for your decisions. But there's still this basic question about whether responsibility should ever play a role in deciding who meets the costs of choices that people make. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk now about the competition. So what I've gone over so far is some kind of core ideas in the philosophy of responsibility. And I hope that that will be useful if you are thinking about encouraging students to enter our practical ethics and responsibility competition, and that these ways of distinguishing between different ideas of responsibility can help them to advance a more nuanced argument. But let me just talk briefly about the practicalities. So what we've had in the past, and this we've run this competition 3 times, is teams of 3 to 5 students submitting videos of up to 4 minutes on a practical ethics issue and the role of responsibility in it. What we're looking for is videos that are well researched, right? Videos where it's clear that the students have done some of their own independent research and that are well informed both factually and ethically. And we're also looking for teamwork, right? It should be clear how everyone is involved. It doesn't have to be in front of the camera, but if there are students who are involved off camera, so in writing the script or in filming, that should be made clear in the video, maybe in a credit sequence. Debbie, yes, no problem. We'll make these slides available. Here, so most teams get these 2 points absolutely right? There are rarely any problems with these 2 points. Here's where some teams do fall down. So here are a couple of other things we're looking for. We are looking for an argument. Now, some teams enter videos which are very interesting, and they are, in a sense, overviews of the various possible positions that you could take about a practical ethics issue when it comes to responsibility. Right, so you might have teams that are giving us different views about whether people can be responsible, or use the example I just gave, about whether responsibility should ever be a factor in healthcare allocation. And they'll say, here's the doctor's view, they say yes, here's the patient's view, they say no, and that's it. And that's good, but it's not quite what we're looking for. What we want is for students to take a position, to offer us an argument for a particular view. So yes, responsibility should be a factor in healthcare allocation, and here's why. Or no, it certainly shouldn't, and here's why. Or here's when it should. Similarly, it should be nice and clear why they've taken that position. So again, some teams go a step further than the kind of thing that I've just described, and they offer a bunch of different viewpoints, and then at the end they say, and this is our viewpoint, this is what we believe. But all they do is state what they believe. And again, that's not quite enough. It should be clear at every stage of the argument being presented in the video how that supports the view being taken at the end, right? Here's what we think and why. So rather than here's approach A, here's approach B, and we prefer approach B, it should be really clear why they think approach B is stronger. Here are the strengths of approach B. Here are some problems for it that we think can be met. Originality is always a bonus, but of course by originality we don't mean that students should be coming up with ideas that are completely revolutionizing the field of philosophy. That's judged relative to age and educational level. What we're looking for with originality is something we wouldn't expect students at this stage to be coming up with. And finally, really important, given that we're talking about a video that might end up being featured on our website, students need to remember to check copyright, right? If they're using still images or video clips from the web, they need to be absolutely clear that they have the right to use those, and those aren't kind of under copyright. Finally, what are we not looking for? What do we not particularly care about when we're judging this competition? We don't care about evidence of fancy equipment or software, right? If the video is filmed on a mobile phone, that's fine, as long as we can hear what's being said, and as long as we can kind of see nice and clearly what's going on. We're not looking for name dropping of particular philosophers. So particularly for students who are studying philosophy, they'll sometimes bring in, here's what Kant thinks, or here's what Bentham thinks. That's fine in a sense, but as I said before, it should be really nice and clear how what's being said contributes to the conclusion, right? There are no bonus points just for knowing the names of particular philosophers. We're not looking for students to talk about any particular ethical issue, right? There's no ethical issue where we'll think, oh yeah, this really kind of ticks the boxes and is more likely to go through. We provide some suggestions on the competition website, but the teams really should pick whatever issue they want, right? Whatever they're interested in, whatever they're passionate about. And finally, a problem that we have again seen a few times is teams who have obviously gone over the time limit and get under the time limit by artificially speeding up the video, right? So running the video at double time. Don't do that, or don't let your students do that rather. It's very irritating to watch. They're very unlikely to be chosen. And so if teams have gone over, they should either try to edit out a small bit of the video, or they'll have to reshoot and make sure it's under time. Okay, more details available here on our competition website. As I said to Debbie, we'll make these slides available to you. And there are past entries that students can watch on our YouTube channel.